A question. Can photography be humane? 2011 Prix Carmignac, Robin Hammond has made a career in witnessing and documenting change. We're going to hear what is in store for us today.
Okay, thank you. I'm Robin Hammond. I'm a photojournalist. I'm also the director of this organization, Witness Change, which is a very small non-profit organization which attempts to use storytelling to support marginalized groups in a way that positively impacts their lives. So, what I'm just going to do is have some pictures running in the background as I speak, just very briefly. And this is, these pictures are here from a project called 1,000 Dreams. I'm very proud of this work. But what's unique for me about this work is I didn't take any of these pictures. This 1,000 Dreams is a project which is about refugees, and all the pictures are taken by refugees. I'm going to talk more about this work a little bit later, but I wanted to start with this. I will reveal why it's relevant. So I'm a professional photojournalist, which means that I mostly go to countries, not my own, and meet people who have a very different lived experience to myself, and I tell these stories. I'm often an outsider. And that's what I think a lot of photojournalists do. I think that's really important. I think that we help people to see and understand the world. And it was in that role 10 years ago that I was awarded the Carmignac Foundation Photojournalism Award. And I'm going to show you some of these pictures. But first of all, I need to show you this because I was awarded this work to do a body of work in Zimbabwe, and I understand a lot of people don't know where Zimbabwe is or why we should be interested. It's this kind of beige-colored, landlocked country. Just south to it is this big neighbor, South Africa, which is where I was living when I did most of this work. So I'd been to Zimbabwe several times before I received the award. And I was working as a photojournalist for the New York Times, The Guardian. You'd go for several days, maybe a couple of weeks at most. But what the Carmignac Award allowed me to do was stay for a long period of time, which is, I think, the dream of most journalists, right? Or photojournalists, is to do long-term, deep work. So it really allowed me to build a relationship with the country and the people. And I should tell you, why was this story important? Well, Zimbabwe has had a very difficult recent past. They had to fight a war of independence against a white supremacist government. Then the country was taken over by a dictator who swiftly went about slaughtering the opposition. Thousands of people were killed. And then they went through a long period of decline where this elite sort of basically took all the resources and all the money. And the impact was, when I was working there, Zimbabwe had the highest inflation in the world and the lowest life expectancy in the world. And also, millions of people had fled the country to South Africa. So the work I was doing there was to document the human impact of these disastrous policies and this corrupt regime. This was a very hard story to do because, essentially my work was to document human suffering and this massive injustice. It was difficult also because myself and my guides were continuously worried about being arrested. We were there doing work that the government didn't want people to see. So the first time I was arrested, I spent just one night in prison. That was one uncomfortable night. Got out, I left the country very quickly. But I wanted to come back to document this exodus, the millions of people, like a third of the population of Zimbabwe had left the country. So it should have been a country of 12 million people. 3 or 4 million people had left to South Africa to try and earn a living to support their families. So I wanted to photograph people leaving the country. So, like I said, I was arrested, I left, I came back. It was one trip too many. I was arrested again. This time I spent 4 weeks in prison, which was a really horrendous experience. But I should just say that, even in prison, I recognized how privileged I was compared to many of the other people. I had people on the outside fighting to get me out. I had people bringing in food, toilet paper and soap, which is, if you live ever without toilet paper or soap, you understand how much you appreciate it when someone gives it to you. So anyway, I left the country. I arrived back in Paris to the offices of Carmignac very late because of my extended stay, and we worked very quickly to create this exhibition and book. I also pitched the story to National Geographic magazine, and so this is something else I need to express gratitude to the Carmignac Foundation for, is that this started what has been a 10-year relationship with this magazine now. One of the few magazines that invests in long-term journalism, so thank you for that. So the whole reason to talk about this work, Zimbabwe, was one, Carmignac Foundation invited me here, so it would be rude not to talk about this work, but also because it kind of represents part of a journey I've been on around my role as a journalist, and maybe as a case study of us slightly older, more experienced journalists, and the role that we could potentially play in, or a changing role we might be able to play. And I'm going to show you a little diagram to sort of illustrate this, in my mind at least. And so I kind of think about this as a spectrum, right? We have a professional photojournalist, myself, for example, going into a country not my own as an outsider, telling the stories of another people. At the other end of the spectrum is that work I started with, right? That 1,000 Dreams work, where people from the community themselves, participants, tell the stories of their own community. You're going to hear, I think, more about this from our next speaker, Fimba, who will probably elaborate more on how he's, I think, been trying to do some of that work as well. The other thing I want to touch on very briefly is after I finished the work in Zimbabwe, I started this not-for-profit organization, Witness Change. And the whole, the name of the organization maybe gives it away, right? It's about documenting and trying to see change happen. And I think that there are a lot of journalists and photojournalists who want to do good work and do good work, and they want to see change come about from their work, but often it's kind of incidental, or it's not part of the design, right? It's like you put work out in the world and you hope that's enough. What I wanted to do with Witness Change is make sure that the impact was baked into the design of the work. And in fact, what we do as an organization is we start with what is the change we want to see and what is the storytelling we need to do in order to create that change. And we have these two sort of main categories, which we talk about: narrative change, like changing how people see a population or understand them, and tangible change, like how do you actually save people's lives by telling stories, right? Or change their lives in a really significant way. So, actually, in this one point, I really want to hasten to add, photojournalism doesn't need to have a reason, right? I think photojournalism for photojournalism's sake is great. And I think that if there are photojournalists here who don't have impact as their main goal, I'm not saying that you're any way lesser or that's wrong. I think fantastic, you should do that work. But for me, there's always been a much greater satisfaction in seeing a positive outcome for the people whose lives I was documenting. So this is me plugging my organization, if you couldn't tell already. And this is, this is the organization, Witness Change. So anyway, back to this spectrum of who tells whose story, right? And so I've put in the middle another story that I've been working on called Where Love is Illegal, which is documenting the stories of LGBT groups around the world, especially for folks living in countries where who they are or who they love is criminalized. And that was a much more collaborative storytelling project. I'm going to talk very quickly about that now as another sort of case study of how our roles might change. So this work I started in 2013. I'd been living on the African continent and working there for about a decade at that point, and I saw this rising tide of homophobia, transphobia, queerphobia, which I think was actually part of a reaction towards greater equality or greater recognition of rights of LGBTQI plus folks in Europe and in North America. And you have conservative elements on the African continent who were like, hell no, that's not going to happen here. In addition to that, you had some lovely American evangelists coming to African countries and whipping up homophobic rhetoric. At the same time, you had NGOs who were non-governmental organizations who were trying to support their LGBT beneficiaries and also their staff. So you had this combination of factors which made life increasingly difficult for queer people on the continent. And so some human rights groups and some newspapers, magazines were talking about this increasing oppression, but very rarely did we actually hear from queer Africans themselves. And so I thought maybe that's something a role I can help to play. So I was photographing in Lagos, which is the commercial capital of Nigeria. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa. And I heard about 5 young men in the north of the country who'd been arrested and put in prison for committing gay acts. So I went up to meet them. By the time I got there, fortunately, they'd been released. And they were really willing to tell me their stories, but there's no way I could take their pictures, they said. And I was like, I'm a visual storyteller. I wondered if there was a way that we could make this work. And so I made a deal with them. I said, look, I've been photographing with this Polaroid film down in Lagos. I'll take the picture. I'll give it to you. If you think it's okay, you give it back. If it's not okay, you tear it up or you keep it or whatever. But also, because this film is really expensive, even before that picture was taken, there was a big conversation about how should this picture be taken that would make them feel safe. And that began this collaborative process, which then went on to happen in 14 different countries over the next 7 years, where these folks really had a strong contribution to how they were being represented. So I wasn't doing it, initially at least, because I thought it was the right thing to do or because they needed to be represented in a way that they thought was authentic. I did it out of necessity. I did it because I wanted them to feel safe and I wanted them to be safe. But what actually evolved out of that was a thought process around how, when you're from a marginalized community and who you are is defined by a majority population who is often hostile towards you, maybe you have a right to be able to contribute to how you're seen, how you're represented. So, and this has actually formed part of the foundation of the organization which I created. So, but not only did I have them be part of authoring their pictures, but actually literally authoring their stories. And so they all wrote their testimonies, and that became a big part of how their stories were told. And these pictures were often, displayed side by side by these handwritten testimonies that they created. So witness change is about creating impact. I can't claim that this project, Where Love is Illegal, the name of the project is called Where Love is Illegal. I can't claim it necessarily changed policies or saved lives, but it's definitely had a role in some really important conversations. This year alone, we've had 25 exhibitions of this work, mostly in countries that criminalize queer folks. We've given out these exhibitions for free and sent them around the world. It's been seen a lot on social media. Millions of people have seen it on social media. We actually launched the project with the cover of Time magazine. And this was particularly gratifying. I photographed the first trans person to appear on the cover of National Geographic. And what was really great for me about it, in terms of amplifying the voices of marginalized groups, is National Geographic printed their words on the cover of the magazine. And other important conversations which took place, I was invited to address the United Nations to talk to them about LGBT rights, which was a very scary experience, more scary than this even, and a bunch of other things. So I feel like as part of that narrative change contribution, it's been really important. So I show you this just to say that at Witness Change, what's really important for us is, like I said, amplifying the voices of marginalized groups. It's also really key that we work with local partners. It's really fundamental to the process. And these things are important because they're right, but actually the reason that we do it is not necessarily just because it's right. It's actually because we feel this is the way to have the greatest impact. If you really want storytelling to change people's lives, we believe it needs to be done in conjunction with local people, because otherwise you can mess it up, right? You don't know what you're doing in the local context. So I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the impact-focused stuff. So, I've spoken about the work with refugees. I've spoken about the work with LGBT groups. I spoke about the work in Zimbabwe. I've also done a lot of work since 2011 on people living with mental health issues. And this is, initially this work started at a sort of intersection between mental health and human rights. How do you, and I was very much involved in campaigns to protect vulnerable people from abuse, but also it sort of evolved also to ensuring that the voices of people living with mental health issues are included in conversations about them. So I don't have time to go into everything we've done here, but just to say that this project is the one that we feel has had the really profound impacts on people's lives in really tangible ways. Just to brag about some of those ways, We helped to get 80 people with mental health issues released from a prison in South Sudan, over 50 people released from chains because they were chained up because they had mental health issues, as well as making sure that they had the medication and jobs, because poverty contributes to people being back in chains. We guaranteed funding for a mental health organization for 4 years from the French government, actually. Convinced a major pharmaceutical company to develop an antipsychotic for developing country contexts, and raised tens of thousands of dollars for mental health organizations. So a bunch of stuff, and as well as this work, which was a collaboration with Human Rights Watch around the de-chaining of folks. And this work continues. I actually go to Ghana in a couple of weeks to work with a partner there. But the work is not just in the global south. Recently, I've been doing work on mental health in teenagers in the US. This was in partner with a local organization that creates learning materials and mental health support in schools. And so I created a series of interviews and video interviews and portraits. The idea being that kids much more likely listen to kids than to adults. You know, we're irrelevant for many of them. So this is, again, working with a local partner who can actually implement the change that comes about from this storytelling. So the target audience of that is these teenage kids, right? But also what's important for us is to, and so this is some of the videos. So what's important for us is also to have we like to work with media partners, because I think that you can really help with reach and in terms of creating that narrative change. And so I'm just swinging back now to this 1000 Dreams project. So you'll recall my sort of spectrum in terms of the roles that journalists play. And here, you know, I'm not taking any pictures, but what I'm doing is I help to design the project in collaboration with mental health organizations and refugee groups. But you know, there's a couple of reasons why I'm not taking any of these pictures. One is, I expressed this before, right? When you have a marginalized group, who the narrative of who they are, so how we define, think about it this way, right? How do we in this room know about refugees? It's from journalists, usually, people like me, who've never been a refugee. It might be from a non-governmental organization, usually not refugees. Politicians, almost certainly not refugees. Media organizations, not refugees. I mean, I think all those groups have the right to talk about refugees, but it's kind of crazy when 99% of the information that we have about refugees is not from refugees themselves. So the idea behind this work is, can we at least have refugees part of the conversations about who they are, rather than it always being outsiders. And so you know, we run a very intensive 8-day workshop followed by 6 months of mentoring. The idea is that we elevate the capacity of refugees to be able to tell their own stories, and we support them through that, and then we make sure that that their voices and their work gets out into press and into exhibitions, however it is, whatever way we can, in order to hopefully create this narrative change. We most recently had an exhibition in the European Parliament, so we're trying to get politicians to think about refugees from refugees' perspectives as well. And the work continues. Tomorrow I fly to Barcelona to do another workshop with another 8 refugees. So far we've trained 60 refugees. They've documented 800 stories. The goal is to get to 1,000 and hopefully contribute to this narrative about who they are. Interestingly, while this has been published all over Europe, it's not been published in France, so if there's any editors in the room here, you can let me know how we can change that. Okay, so, and in fact, you know, and if there's anyone here who thinks that storytelling could play a role in change, this is my pitch to the audience here. You know, I think we should talk about that. I think that there's so much rubbish filling our phones and our newspapers, and maybe we can counter that with stories that are important and stories that support marginalized groups to be heard, and hopefully stories that can have an impact. Thank you.